Hey everybody, my guest today is Professor Richard Chappell, and we're going to talk about effective altruism. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Why don't you give us a brief summary of what effective altruism is?
Sure. So it's standardly sort of defined as the project of trying to find the most effective ways of helping others and putting it into practice. And so it can especially mean when you're talking about resources like money, if you're planning to donate a certain amount of money to charity to try to find more effective charities. But it also applies more broadly to people choosing between careers. If they're wanting to have a sort of morally motivated career, they might look carefully to try to work out how they can do the most good through their career choice. And so more broadly, just sort of thinking about whatever sort of moral efforts or resources we're willing to expend to try to make the world a better place, really trying to find evidence to use those as effectively as possible.
Yeah, that sounds pretty reasonable to me. Is it the same thing as utilitarianism, or how does it relate to utilitarianism?
So it's definitely different. So utilitarianism is much more controversial because utilitarianism is a moral theory which says you're like morally obligated. What you have to do is to do the most good possible and nothing else matters. And effective altruism doesn't make any of those really strong claims. It doesn't necessarily say that you have to do it, that you're failing in your obligations if you're not an effective altruist, or that if you choose less effective things. It would be unfortunate. It's like a lost opportunity. But people can disagree about whether you're doing something wrong or not when you choose a less effective charity. It also doesn't say that like anything goes in terms of like the ends justifying the means. You can be a deontologist and think, no, there are really strict like restrictions on how you can pursue doing good. But it's just within the bounds of permissibility. You should prefer better over worse permissible options. So you can be a deontological effective altruist like that. And there's plenty of room for sort of special obligations, thinking, yeah, you look after your family, your loved ones, you're going to give extra weight to yourself. It's just some sort of portion of your life, not all of it, can be dedicated to try to promote the impartial good.
Okay, so then it doesn't really matter which type of moral theory one adheres to. Seems like every single one would be in favor of effective altruism.
Well, I'd moderate that slightly. I would say all the reasonable ones, as I regard them. But actually, there are some important exceptions. So people who are drawn to a very anti-aggregative conception of ethics, who think it's maybe more important, or at least who think that you can't really add up different sort of costs and benefits to different people and compare them, effective altruism wouldn't really make sense on their way of thinking about the world. But as long as you're okay with the idea that like doing more good is better than doing less good, all else equal, that should be enough to get off the ground, I think.
Yeah, that sounds pretty reasonable to me. I would say if I could save 10 people's lives, that would be better than saving one life. In this conversation, I've thought about Peter Singer already, and he seems to be a supporter of effective altruism. And I wonder if it's because of his utilitarianism that he is in support of effective altruism.
Yeah, so I think it's definitely the case that all utilitarians, I would expect, to be fans of effective altruism. So you don't have to be a utilitarian to like effective altruism, but if you are a utilitarian, then you definitely should want to like do good more effectively. That's basically what the utilitarian project is all about too. Effective altruism says, at least incorporate like an element of something like utilitarian concern for the general good into your life. It's just much more moderate because it doesn't say that's the only thing that matters.
Okay. So it's much more modest in that, right? Like it's not claiming to be a moral theory. It's saying like to the extent that we ought to help others, we should try to maximize the number of people that we help.
Yeah, I think that's one way of characterizing it. I mean, some people would resist even putting it in normative terms at all and just say it's a project that people can choose to engage in, and this is what the project involves, trying to help others more effectively. And they'd maybe resist putting any should into there at all. I'm happy to include the should and say, no, it's a good project that maybe like people probably should engage with to some extent, or at least it's better to than not to. And so, yeah, insofar as we've got some resources, it's worthwhile to use them more effectively rather than less so to do more good.
So now I'm thinking about Kant and his imperfect duties, right? So he thought that we have imperfect duties to help out other people. So it sounds like he would be in favor of it, right? Like if you think that we have some duty towards others, then why wouldn't you want to help more people if you could?
Yeah, I think there's no like obvious reason why a Kantian would need to be opposed to effective altruism or why they couldn't easily support it as well. Sociologically, I'm not sure that I really know of so many Kantians who seem enthused about it, but I'd be curious to sort of hear from them about why that is. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, and then coming from a virtue ethics perspective, I mean, you would think that the virtuous person would be charitable and they would be compassionate and try to help the poor and stuff like that. So I feel like effective altruism would also fit very well under a virtue ethics framework.
I definitely think so. So I'm quite a fan of sort of the idea of exploring a kind of beneficence-focused virtue ethics, which precisely takes like benevolence, for example, as being like the most important virtue, and or at least one that's a very important part of a good life, and that it should be express itself in a way of like trying to implement it effectively rather than less effectively. So I think a virtue ethicist should have room for effective altruism in the same way. I'll just flag one thing that many virtue ethicists would find controversial about effective altruism is that there can be tension between our kind of natural sympathetic expressions of concern on the one hand and doing the most effective thing on the other hand. And so you can think about thought experiments. You can think about the child drowning in Singer's Pond, the variation of a thought experiment where you have in your pocket enough money to save 2 lives. And if you jump you don't have time to get the money out of your pocket. If you jump in and save the child right before you, then you won't be able to save the 2 children you are about to go and donate that money to. And so the virtue ethicist might want to say, well, the virtuous thing is to express this, act upon your sort of empathy and sympathy and save the child directly in front of you, even though that's less effective than walking by and donating the money to save multiple children. So there could be a conflict, at least in hypothetical cases, between effectiveness and some intuitive virtues.
I'm glad that you brought up the pond example, because I think that is reflective, I guess, of most people's experiences. Like most people emotionally are going to react more strongly to suffering that they can see, right? Even though if there are more people suffering far away from them.
Exactly.
Right? So in that sense, effective altruism is like utilitarianism in that it kind of pushes us to act against those feelings.
Right. And I think that's part of what's so challenging about it, is it does say, don't just act upon whatever like moral motivation first grips you, even when it's a good one. Like helping people, you learn about some disaster and you're like initially motivated to like donate to disaster relief. That's a great motivation, wanting to help people. And then effective altruists come along and they say, hang on, hold that thought. Look into whether the disaster relief charity is going to be as effective or more effective or less so than other possible ways of using that money, like ongoing problems like malaria, for example. Could donate to the Against Malaria Foundation instead, and maybe that would save more lives. If that's true, then you've got a strong moral reason, effective altruists say, to donate the money to the Against Malaria Foundation rather than the disaster relief organization. And I think people find that a little bit confronting to like have those emotions challenged in that way.
Yeah. I think personally, I would save the child drowning over donating the $2. I don't think I think it wouldn't even be a conflict in my mind. I would just react in the way that I thought was right.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense to just kind of have a standing disposition that when if you see a child drowning, you can't just walk past them. You can't like watch a child drown right before your eyes, right? That would be like just too inhumane. So I think it makes a lot of sense that a lot of people would have that standing disposition. And I expect actually in practice, I think most effective altruists would agree and endorse that disposition and would likewise save the child right before their eyes. So even though in a sense, a lot of the theorizing behind effective altruism would say, well, technically speaking, you've got stronger moral reason to save 2 children. Just because they're not right before your eyes doesn't make them any less important. But we're human beings and we can only do so much to go against our nature. So I think of effective altruism maybe as more just sort of pushing us on the margins. So it's not going to condemn someone for saving a child drowning in a pond before their eyes. Like obviously that's a good beneficent thing to do. But just in the cases where it's like not that extreme, it's more like the disaster relief charity versus a different charity, insofar as we can more easily push ourselves to like go beyond our gut reactions and try to find the more effective ways to help. That does tend to be worth doing, more so than we usually do.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. It sounds like effective altruism as a theory, it's or a principle or approach, I don't know what you want to call it, seems to be quite bare, right? Like it's not very full of like specific substantive content. So for instance, I haven't heard anything from you about what it means to reduce suffering, or what suffering is, or what well-being is, right? So it sounds like you could adopt whatever theory you want about suffering or whatever theory you want about well-being, and effective altruism would equally apply.
Yeah, I think that's right. So it's a very sort of broad, sparse, sort of fairly neutral kind of background idea. And then it sort of needs to be fleshed out by your more particular moral, theoretical commitments regarding well-being and so forth. So that's both an advantage and a disadvantage in some ways. So, obviously the advantage of it, such a big tent, lots of people can get on board with the idea that, doing good more effectively would be worthwhile. But it's then going to give rise to a lot of disagreements within the big tent from people who have very different views about what is important, what makes for a good life, as well as just disagreements about which different causes are more promising than others, like empirical disagreements about what is or isn't effective. There's lots of room for disagreement there.
It also doesn't sound like it's making any claims about future generations, right? Like you could be a person who does think that future generations matter and that we have obligations toward them, or you could be a person who does it and yet still be an effective altruist.
That's right. So this is actually a big sort of clash within the effective altruist tent, is between sort of near-termists and long-termists, is one way of characterizing this. So the long-termists tend to think the long-term future is really important, future generations matter, and insofar as we can do things that improve the chances of humanity flourishing for a long, long time into the future, it's super important that we do that. It could end up trumping the importance of saving lives today. Even a small chance of preventing extinction could end up outweighing other kinds of goods and benefits. And then the near-termists tend to reject that for, there could be various different reasons. Some of them it's just practical. Some will say, I don't really think there's anything I can do that's going to prevent extinction. So it doesn't seem worth focusing on for practical reasons. But there can also be more philosophical disagreement in the way that you described, where someone just says, I don't think the future generations matter, or at least, that would seem kind of repugnant if you thought it was fine for future generations to suffer. Surely that would be bad. But some take the view that at least having good lives existing in future rather than no lives at all is a matter of sort of neutrality. So I disagree with that. I think that good lives are sort of intrinsically valuable, and so it's better than the neutrality of having nothing. But there is room for disagreement there.
Yeah, I interviewed somebody about long-termism a while back, and I was trying to get an understanding of the relation between utilitarianism, long-termism, and effective altruism. And I'm still not entirely sure what the relation between all three of these things are, right? So you're saying maybe effective altruists can be split up into two camps. Some are near-termists and some are long-termists. Okay, so can there be near-termists and long-termists who are not effective altruists?
Yeah, I think you could probably do a similar kind of distinction quite apart from effective altruism. So, I mean, for any kind of vision about what's important, you could just have people who are focused on really long-term concerns and those who are just focused on more immediate concerns. And so you could imagine a disagreement between, for example, maybe climate activists who are really worried about climate change for the sake of future generations, not just the current one. And then you could imagine people arguing against the climate activists saying, no, you're too focused on hypothetical future people. Who cares about them? We should just help people who are starving in the here and now, focus more on famine relief, maybe create more coal power plants so that there's more economic growth to help people who are starving now, even if it leads to a worse climate in the future. You could imagine a disagreement like that.
Oh, okay. But those near-termists would still be effective altruists, would they not be?
Well, they wouldn't have to be, I was thinking. So even if they weren't, what would be a good way of making it so that they clearly weren't effective altruists? Well, suppose that they're not at all cosmopolitan. So suppose they don't care about anyone outside of their own country. They just think, America will be wealthier if we don't worry about climate change. So Americans today will be better off. So let's just do that. So that would be a contrast between a kind of a nationalistic sort of near-termist versus a long-termist who thinks, no, even just as far as American greatness is concerned, the country will be greater in 100 years or 200 years if we take care of it.
Okay, so part of effective altruism is that it's not nationalistic.
Right.
Okay, so that is a substantive kind of part of it. Okay.
I think that's right, yeah. So it is important that it's got a very broad moral circle of concern. So when we're talking about making the world a better place, we're not just talking about making the world better for some narrow subset of beings. It's for anyone with interests. So it tends to include, not just, potentially future people if they matter at all. I guess there's dispute about that one. But definitely people in different countries, And I think for almost all effective altruists, I'm not sure if any really can't if they denied this, but also non-human animals would matter as well. And so there tends to be significant concern about the amount of harm that we do through factory farming, for example.
Okay. Yeah. So any being that can suffer, basically.
Yeah.
Okay. Sometimes I hear that effective altruism is controversial. And I don't know why some people don't like it. Can you explain to me what the concerns are?
I also would like to better understand why people find it controversial, because it does seem like, I mean, the core idea, as I explained it at the start, is just so kind of bland, right? It's just like, try to do good more effectively rather than less effectively. Who could disagree with that? And I think when I say things like this to people who don't like effective altruism, they say, well, that's not the thing I'm objecting to. And I think maybe sometimes what people are objecting to is not the core idea of effective altruism, but maybe they're objecting to some particular, more contingent feature of how the effective altruism movement is actually instantiated, or at least their conception of it, which might not always be accurate. But so, for example, you can have lots of people who are very upset about, or at least think it's misguided, that a lot of effective altruists are so concerned to try to minimize risks of extinction. They think all the attention that goes to worries about artificial intelligence, worries about pandemics, these kinds of things, they think is just overblown, and we shouldn't be so worried about existential risks. They see that as a distraction from whatever they view as more important. But I'm always a bit puzzled by that, because I kind of feel like, if you've got an argument that you think that actually those things are not as important as many effective altruists think that they are, then you can just share that argument, and it could be something that's like within the bounds of effective altruism. There's room to disagree about what is or isn't effective, right? So sometimes I think it comes from a more methodological source of disagreement, maybe a worry that if they felt constrained to play by the effective altruist game, where you have to do cost-benefit analysis and talk about probabilities and have this kind of attempt to really get a sense of what the most effective thing would be, any attempt to do that will end up pushing away from the kinds of priorities that they prefer. And so they don't like effective altruism for that reason. So that's very much the sense I got from people like Alice Crowry and some of the others who've published in a volume she recently wrote about. She and a couple of co-authors, it was called something like The Good It Promises, the Harm It Does, Critical Essays on Effective Altruism. And the general sort of gist I got from that volume was that they felt that effective altruism was in tension with sort of properly valorizing left-wing activists. So they felt like there was a tension between effective altruism and social justice activism. And so they supported social justice activism, and so they saw effective altruism as a threat to that. And that was a little puzzling to me, because I think, seems like promoting social justice, at least reasonably construed, is going to be part of making the world overall a better place. So it seems like it could have a place within, effective altruism as a big tent. But they saw it as threatening, and that could be part of the controversy.
Interesting. Maybe the disagreement is that effective altruism seems to focus on our individual behavior in terms of like charity, versus like social justice movements tend to want to change institutions and governments and policies and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's definitely something that gets discussed, this sort of institutional or systems critique that effective altruists are too focused on individual choices like charitable donations and insufficiently focused on political movements, institutional change. I don't know that there's any essential reason why one would think that effective altruism had to be like opposed to politics or like systemic change. In particular, I think the long-termist branch of it does tend to be actually quite focused on trying to bring about systemic change. They want, regulation for AI safety, for example, to try to prevent AI companies from doing dangerous things. And so I think that critique might have emerged out of a response to like the very first early stages of effective altruism, where it was very focused on like randomized controlled trials to find the most effective global health charities. And it was really that part of the effective altruism movement was kind of presenting itself in contrast, or as a way of responding to aid skepticism. So you have these aid skeptics, people worried like, how can we really be sure that our money is even going to do good at all? There are a lot of ineffective or even counterproductive charities out there. Effective altruists give their own examples as well of that sort of thing. And so the response is, well, we need to look at evidence and really try to find good ways to use those things. But I think that sort of framing of like the focus on randomized controlled trials was really contingent to that particular discussion, the pushback against the aid skeptics. I don't see it as an essential part of effective altruism itself that it would say that you weren't allowed to do anything for which there wasn't a randomized controlled trial supporting it. And again, I think the example of long-termism really shows that effective altruists are quite open to doing things that are quite speculative and uncertain whether it's going to work or not, and they can involve big sort of hope for systemic change. It just sort of needs to be supported by reasons for thinking that this is a high priority and a higher priority than what we could otherwise be doing with our time and resources.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I feel like because it's so bare bones, that effective altruism has to be right, almost by definition, not by definition, but almost like conceptually, it would seem to follow that it would be better than ineffective altruism.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Just think about what the point of altruism is, right? The point of it is not so that I just feel good, right? The point of it is so that I help other people. Okay, well, if that's the goal, then why would you engage in something that doesn't actually help other people as much? You know what I mean? So almost conceptually, it follows.
Yeah, I think there is something of a truism about it. It's sort of very truistic, the underlying principles. And sometimes people say that as a criticism, like, why would you even bother saying this thing that's so obvious? But then you look around and, there are all these billionaires who are like donating $1 billion to provide free education to doctors, to like subsidize doctors training in America. And it's like, that's clearly not the best possible use of $1 billion, right? They could have done so much more. And so insofar as it just is really commonplace, actually, for people to just not give very much thought, it seems, to how they can best use their resources. Just drawing attention to the truism that, like, hey, if we can do more good rather than less, that's worth doing. I think that makes it a worthwhile thing to say and to try to draw people's attention to.
Does it share this democratic ethos with utilitarianism? And what I mean by that is that everyone counts for one. So everyone's suffering is equally disvaluable. So the king's suffering is equally disvaluable as the peasant's suffering.
Yeah, so as far as the Effective Altruist project is concerned, yeah, everyone's going to count equally. Their suffering matters equally. It doesn't matter whose it is. That's not to say that you have to have that particular attitude of impartiality in every respect of your life. So, when you take off your effective altruist hat and go and have dinner, you don't have to think that the kids down the street matter just as much as your own child. You can have partiality towards your family and the rest of your life. But insofar as you're doing the effective altruist project, that involves a kind of impartiality. Yeah.
So then it would also prioritize the poor. Right? Everybody counts for one, but we prioritize relieving the suffering of the poor because we would get the most bang for our buck by contributing to stuff that the poor suffer from.
Yeah, so this is a big thing that was emphasized in Will MacAskill's first book, Doing Good Better. He has this 100 times multiplier, where the idea is that our money just goes roughly 100 times further in the poorest countries than it does in a place like America. And so even insofar as you're like motivated to help, the poor people around us in our own society, it just turns out that we can do so much more to help poorer people who are further away from us. It'll make a much bigger difference. And so it would seem kind of objectionably biased to be helping fewer people nearby rather than more people far away. So that's definitely a message that effective altruism tries to encourage people to think about.
I'm trying to think of other potential objections against it. Because like you said, I almost feel like it's a truism. It's almost philosophically uninteresting because it seems so obviously true. And the criticisms that I've heard are like what you said. They seem to be contingent because, again, it's effective altruism is so bare bones, right? So I think more recently people were talking about Sam Bankman-Fried, right? But it's like, well, that movement is not, he's not reflective of the movement, right? Like just because he did something bad, it doesn't necessarily mean that effective altruism is bad.
Right. Yeah, so it was definitely very bad, like PR for effective altruism to have like someone who was so prominent in the movement turn out to be a complete crook. That's not what anyone likes to see from their associates, but it's certainly not the case that he's representative of what other effective altruists are doing or trying to do.
So in terms of the empirical data then, what seems to be the most effective way for us to reduce the sufferings of the poor?
So as far as I'm aware, and I'm not really an expert on this, like directly, except insofar as like I read a bunch of stuff by GiveWell and other people who are broadly in the sort of orbit of effective altruism. So I'd encourage people to just go to givewell.org and read GiveWell's own reports to learn more. But as a general rule, charities that address malaria are able to do so extremely effectively. So their Against Malaria Foundation distributes insecticide-treated bed nets. Super cheap, can cover a whole group of people very, very cheaply and easily, and end up saving lives for less than, I think, about $5,000 on average per child's life saved. So it's pretty extraordinary how easily we can save someone's life by donating a portion of our income to a charity like that. I think the big sort of controversies and difficulties when it comes to assessing sort of effective altruist options is when you're picking between very different kinds of charities. So you just asked specifically about helping the global poor there. But there's very difficult questions about how to weigh saving a poor human's life versus donating to, for example, an animal welfare charity which does corporate campaigns for cage-free eggs and so tries to reduce suffering on a massive scale for non-humans, for egg-laying hens. And then comparing that in turn with a more long-termist focused charity that tries to reduce risks of extinction, whether from pandemics, from AI, or whatever. It's very difficult to evaluate and assess those such different cause areas, which I think does result in a lot of just kind of personal judgment calls. It's not like there's an obvious correct answer about how to do those weightings.
Yeah, we have to compare the sufferings, right? And we have to somehow put some number to it if we want to make our altruism the most effective, right? So I think that would be much easier if we're only talking about humans, like humans to humans. But what about a human to a chicken, like you said? Do we value this chicken's suffering equally? Like, I don't know if I do. I know that I don't.
Yeah. But that's kind of a failure of altruism on our part, right? Like, we don't care about beings that are sufficiently different from us. And we might think, that's kind of a moral failing on our part. Maybe like if we were more morally ideal, we probably would care more about, a lot of people care a lot about cute animals, about puppies and kittens. Pigs and chickens, not so much. But, there's no sense in which puppies and kittens are like objectively more meritorious or morally important than chickens and pigs. And so I feel like this is another aspect in which effective altruism, it's not intellectually, philosophically controversial, but it's very practically challenging, just because none of us, I think our natural human motivations just are not pushing us towards doing the most good possible as effectively and impartially as we can. So insofar as we accept the idea that actually it is worth doing more good rather than less good, no matter who it is that's affected by it, then it can be really confronting because it pushes us to really consider new things that we previously wouldn't have. Some effective altruists even suggest maybe shrimp's welfare is this highly neglected thing. There are so many huge numbers of shrimp getting caught up, and if they experience suffering when that happens, the huge numbers are such that it could massively outweigh the amount of human suffering that occurs. Sounds crazy to suggest, maybe our top priority should be reducing shrimp suffering. I don't believe that. It's not something I've ever worked towards. But I think part of the challenge of effective altruism is that the ideas make us think, hey, maybe we are neglecting something that actually is morally important here. And we should think a bit more carefully about whether it's something we should be trying to do something about.
Yeah, I think it's more reasonable to say that animal suffering matters. I just don't know if it's as defensible to say that it matters equally to human suffering. And I think we can work within some sort of effective altruism framework to actually reach that conclusion, because you may think that given our more sophisticated cognitive abilities, the ways that we suffer is actually greater. We can suffer greater than non-human animals. And so because of that, we should reduce human suffering. I don't know how much a shrimp can suffer. I'm not even sure how we can, find that out empirically.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I'd be interested to know more. There are definitely people who know a lot more about that than I do. So yeah, I definitely agree that if it turns out to be the case that you poke a human with a knife and they just suffer more than when you poke a chicken with a knife, then that gives you reason to try to prevent humans getting poked with knives more than it gives you reason to prevent chickens being poked by knives. But suppose that you've got an equal amount of suffering in both cases. So that's different, right? So it might be that You have to do more worse things to the chicken to get them to experience an equal amount of suffering from what the human would. But still, if you have reached a point where they're now experiencing an equal amount of awful suffering, and stuff that happens on factory farms is pretty awful and probably a lot worse than almost any human would experience in their lives, one would hope, then it really does raise those tricky challenges.
Yeah, if they're suffering to the same degree and even potentially can suffer to the same degree as human beings, I mean, I would almost think that they would qualify as persons at that point. You know what I mean? I feel like it's almost like the ability that makes us persons, the capacities that make us persons are what enable us to attain higher goods, but also enable us to suffer like the worst bads, And so if other animals have the same capacity, then I would say then it's more on par, then it's like 1-to-1. So then in that case, let's say shrimp, hypothetically can suffer the same degree as humans can. And there are way more shrimp than human beings. Does effective altruism tell us that we ought to protect the shrimp more than other human beings?
At least if we were in a position to make more of a difference there. So it's going to depend on tractability as well. But if we can prevent more suffering, even though it's the shrimp that we're preventing the suffering from happening to, then I do think the underlying principles would suggest that could be the higher priority. I mean, there's room to disagree. So, as with the issue we saw in long-termism, you could have someone who's on board with effective altruism in a very broad sense, but rejects the idea that future people matter in the same way, or that it's valuable to bring positive, happy lives into existence. You could have someone who similarly agreed with effective altruism in a broad sense, generally in favor of effectiveness and so forth, but just didn't think that actually non-human animals have the kind of moral standing that humans do, such that even if they experience the same amount of suffering, it wouldn't matter morally as much. The term's a little bit vague as to where you draw the boundary for who's going to count as effective altruist or not. I don't know that there's an official definition there for how to draw those boundaries. It's just kind of a cluster concept. And so you could have someone who's an effective altruist in certain core respects, but nonetheless disagrees about the animal welfare issue, for example.
Yeah, it's interesting because there are these deep philosophical questions that can, depending how you answer them, really do lead you to a different conclusion. And that's intellectually interesting. Okay? But effective altruism is about being practical, right? It's giving you practical guidance. And when we take it in that light, I feel like it is pretty uncontroversial, so much so that it's a truism. And even if people push back on it, they're only doing it as an intellectual exercise, right? So for instance, if I'm saying look, hey, what's the point of being altruistic, right? Oh, it's to help other people, right? So, I mean, shouldn't you be effective, right? That's better than being ineffective, right? Yeah, I agree with that, And then maybe you kind of summarize effective altruism, and now they're trying to poke holes in your argument, right? But again, as an intellectual exercise, I think it is interesting. But what are they currently doing with their lives? Are they even altruistic, at all? You know what I mean? So it's almost like when people try to push back on Singer's, pond argument, and it's like, okay, yeah, it is very demanding, but what are you doing right now? Could you be doing more? And I feel like the vast majority of people, taking a philosophy class in American colleges, they could probably be doing more, right? And yet they're still pushing back. It's like, look, I think you can admit that you can do more. So it's like they're almost so focused on the intellectual stuff so that they can push back on it and totally avoid and ignore the fact that it's supposed to give you practical guidance.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. So there is a real risk of people getting too hung up about the kind of the border cases or sort of the extreme, where the principles would lead you if you got 100% on board. And I think, Singer's sort of famine, affluence, and morality argument is a great example of this. Very few people are willing to get 100% on board with that and donate to the point of marginal utility themselves. But it would be a real mistake to respond to the article by saying, well, it's just too extreme, and so I'm going to ignore it. It's no, there's a lot you can learn, even if you're not willing to go 100% of the way. Maybe even just 10% of the way would be a significant moral improvement, and you could agree, even if you don't think 100% would be right. It might be that everyone could agree that going 10% of the way there would be a very significant moral improvement compared to nothing. And I think effective altruism should be viewed in a similar way. So people sometimes talk about this train to crazy town. If you sort of take utilitarian ideas on board too much and start thinking about huge numbers and tiny probabilities and trillions of shrimp versus one human and like all these different sort of hypotheticals, it can lead to some weird seeming sort of conclusions. But if people end up sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater there and just sort of dismissing the ideas entirely, then I think they're really missing out, as you say, on the practical upshot, which is that, yeah, we pretty much all of us, or anyone who's in a position to be talking about these ideas to begin with, is in a position to do a significant amount more good than they already do, probably. And that would be worth doing. And they should especially, it would be worth doing it more effectively rather than less so, since there are some pretty big differences depending on how you end up directing your efforts and resources. So yeah, it's worth giving more thought to than people ordinarily do, even if they don't necessarily end up agreeing 100% with general, like the complete effective altruist ideology or whatever.
Maybe part of it stems from the fact that people don't want to think that they're bad people.
Yes.
Because Singer's really good at that, making people feel bad.
Yeah, it's super confronting.
It's like I tell my students, I'm like, look, like I have a MacBook Air. I just bought this, M3 MacBook Air. Did I need to buy that? No. Could I have saved someone's life by, using that money differently? Probably, but I didn't. And it's just like when nobody wants to admit that they're somehow not that good. And so there must be something wrong with the theory. I'm not the problem, right? It's Peter Singer's argument.
Wrong with us, yeah.
Yeah, nothing's wrong with me. It's a theory that's wrong, right? And I was like, no, I think there's a mistake there, right?
Yeah.
There's two. I understand why these kind of like theories get a pushback, right? It's like, yeah, we don't want to feel that we're guilty and we're letting all these people die, but. I mean, I feel like that's one of the benefits and advantages of doing philosophy, right? It's like you just kind of make yourself think more critically about your own situation, how you relate to other people.
Yeah, and it can be super challenging. The conclusions that you reach won't always be comfortable. I mean, one thing that I'm kind of hopeful about is a way to kind of try to push back against that more sort of psychological resistance. I had a blog post recently called "Imperfection is Okay," where it's basically just talking about this idea that we're very reluctant to admit that we've done anything like morally wrong or even like sort of morally imperfect. But if you stop and think about it, like none of us would claim to be morally perfect, right? So once you just admit that, yeah, I'm not perfect. Sometimes I do things that are not what I would have most moral reason to do. It would have been better for me to do something else. And you can just admit that. And that's true of everybody. And I think once you're more comfortable admitting that, hopefully that can also make us more comfortable than recognizing, okay, one particular thing that would have been better would have been if I'd donated a bit more money and saved a child's life yesterday. Maybe tomorrow I'll do better.
Yeah, I think the reason why at least Singer's argument gets a lot of pushback is because he uses the child drowning as the example, right? And nobody wants to believe that they're the person who's not going to save the child, right? They're like, oh, like I'm not going to ruin my suit. I just bought this suit, like nobody wants to admit that they're going to be that person. So there's already this initial repulsion to that type of argument where what he's trying to say, it's like, no, it's just the theory is just too demanding. And it's not that I'm just that bad of a person.
Yeah. And I think there are ways to sort of resist that implication. So I think people are right to look at Singer's argument and think they're not as bad as the person who would walk past a child and watch them drown. That's really true. When you respond that way, you're right that you're not as bad as that person, because it would take an unusual degree of callousness to be able to ignore the really vivid interests of a child drowning right before your eyes. Right? That's a pretty special case. It's a much more sort of reasonable degree of like altruistic concern that many decent people could have remains compatible with failing to donate to someone on the other side of the world who you can't see. And so you're not unusually callous when you fail to donate to the people on the other side of the world the way that you would be if you failed to save a child drowning before your eyes. So there is a real difference in our moral character there and in the degree of blameworthiness of the two agents in the two situations. But I guess the thing I would want to stress is just we shouldn't just be thinking about ourselves and like how good or bad we are and how blameworthy we are. We should be thinking about what's worth doing. And I think the force of Singer's argument is that saving a child, like how worthwhile it is to save a child's life, doesn't depend on their proximity to you, whether they're visible or not. How blameworthy you are for not doing it, that might depend on whether they're visible to you or not. But how worthwhile it is doesn't. And so we can see it's really worthwhile to try to do more to help others, even though we maybe not terrible. We wouldn't necessarily have to think that we were moral monsters or completely blameworthy when we fail to do that.
Interesting. I like this distinction between blameworthiness and worthwhileness, right? So you can be more blameworthy for letting the child drown.
Yep.
Okay. All right. And that essentially just speaks to a person's character.
That's right. Yeah, there's quality of will. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what about life extension technology? So you could imagine increasing well-being by reducing the suffering of the poor or by extending the positive well-being that people experience. What's your opinion about that?
Interesting. I don't really have a settled opinion on it. I guess I'm tentatively in favor of things that like extend people's lives and improve their health. So, if someone came up with a cure for cancer, for example, that would be a good thing. And that would have the result of extending people's lives in a good way and reducing suffering, or at least putting it off until they got something else, maybe that was a terminal illness. So it does seem worthwhile to extend lives. I would worry. We can at least imagine sort of hypothetical cases where I would worry about it. So if you imagine like extending it to the point of like literal immortality, and then we just ended up not having any kind of like generational replacement anymore, but there was just like one permanent generation of immortals, and that was all there was that ever existed, I feel like that would kind of be a loss to the world. I think having new generations come through is kind of important for part of the value I see in the world. And so I would worry if like too much attention got pushed towards just making existing lives better and not enough towards, saving young people's lives and helping ensure that new generations were coming through. So I could see possible trade-offs there. But certainly as far as the idea of like just am I for or against things like curing cancer, extending life and well-being in that way? Yeah, of course I'm in favor.
Yeah, I was thinking of human enhancement stuff. So like extending your life indefinitely, not necessarily, immortality, but just significantly extending the human lifespan by keeping us young. Because I think that's what a lot of these human enhancement folks want, right? Okay. And the reason why I bring that up is because I think this is an intellectual exercise, right? That there is some role of fairness that should be involved here, right? So let's say you can reduce a certain amount of suffering from a global poor, right? Their lives already suck, but we can make them suck less. And but we could also get the same prudential value by extending a rich person's life. That rich person already had a nice and cushy life, right? And it seems that there would be some unfairness there if we help the rich person over the poor person, even though we get the same prudential value out of that action. Would you agree?
So I wouldn't personally. So I have a lot of sympathy for people who do have those more kind of prioritarian intuitions. So the idea that we should give priority to the worst off, not just for the kind of standard utilitarian reason that we can make a bigger difference to the worse off, the money goes further that we talked about previously. But even in principle, even if you could do just as much good for someone who is better off, there's just more moral reason, maybe a reason of fairness, as you say, to help the person who's worse off. Philosophically, I don't agree with that. I think a benefit is a benefit and we should count everyone's interests equally. And it would be kind of a bias against the better off person to say an equal benefit to them counted for less. So, I know not many people share my view on that. I have an unusual view, but I'm a utilitarian rather than a prioritarian personally. So I do think that we should count all benefits equally. It's interesting to think about the more sort of practical, you might almost say political implications of pursuing some of these things. Because I think sometimes people have objections to things like human enhancement. The fairness-based objections tend to strike me as very short-sighted. They're worried about the idea that like in the first 5 years of the technology existing, it will only be accessible to rich people. That's like being like opposed to the invention of the personal computer, because when they first came out, first computers were only accessible to rich people. Any new technology, it's initially expensive to create, and only the wealthiest people will have access to it. But as time goes on and more people, more money is put into investment for creating and improving these things, it ends up becoming much more widely accessible. And so I'm generally in favor of technological progress. And I think, it would be better for the world if in the, medium-term future, everyone was able to have access to more sort of enhancement options, enhancement technology. And the only way to get there, or at least, tends to be that the most efficient way to get there, I think, is through market mechanisms, which will mean that the very first step, it'll be the rich people who get the advantage. But they will end up making it accessible to everyone as the technology develops further.
Yeah. I've heard libertarians make that argument, right? It's like, okay, yeah, it's going to be available to the rich at the beginning. So, right? Like every other technology was like that too. And so if we want this technology to exist and eventually help the poor, then we allow the rich to pay more in the beginning. I want to get back to this idea of fairness. I think it's interesting. So you're more you're utilitarian and not a prioritarian.
Yeah.
I was understanding fairness in a somewhat different light. So the way that I understood prioritarianism is that, look, like there's just this much suffering counts more than additional positive well-being, because there is some threshold that we think of quality of life that we think everybody should have, because it just means that you have the minimum necessities to do what you want to do, right? So it's almost like an empirical claim about what you need to live an autonomous life, right? And I was approaching it from a slightly different perspective, which is that it is unfair for us to help the rich person over the poor person, because the poor person's life has already been really bad and the rich person's life has already been really good, right? So in a sense, we are prioritizing the poor person, but it's not because I believe that there is some sort of threshold where they have like a minimal means of living an okay quality life. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so I wasn't imagining the prioritarian as being committed to any kind of threshold idea like that, or making an empirical claim or generalization. I was thinking of it as the claim that in principle, we have more moral reason to help people the worse off that they are. And it could be based on a fairness kind of idea. But the core idea is, yeah, the worse off someone is, the more reason we have to give a fixed size benefit to them rather than to someone else who's already better off.
Yeah. Oh, no. And there was another term that was used before. It was like a Sufficit Arian, right? So maybe they're the ones who think that there's some sort of threshold, right? And then everybody above the threshold, then they just count equally. It doesn't matter who you help. Yeah. So then for a prioritarian, then let's say you do have a spectrum of well-being and suffering throughout the world, but everybody is living a pretty decent life already. It's just that some people are living really awesome lives instead. So I guess if you're a prioritarian in that situation, you would still give priority to those suffering more. Yeah, I wasn't really thinking about those type of cases. I think it was just like, it's almost like the fact that this person has had like no cake, it's worse in terms of fairness, right? Versus this other person who's had so many slices of cake, right? And we can do something that would give, either person one slice of cake.
Yeah, I find it really hard to separate out those fairness intuitions from more like background psychological assumptions. Like when I imagine that case, I just think the person who hasn't had any cake yet is going to get a lot more enjoyment out of it than someone who's already stuffed themselves, right? So, there's just a really obvious utilitarian reason why we want to give cake to people who haven't had any yet. And so trying to like bracket that standard utilitarian reason and try to say, no, holding all else equal, there's this extra reason of fairness on top of however more benefit there would be. That's what I find a little bit tricky to do intuitively.
Yeah, let me think of another situation. So resource allocation, like situations like during COVID and like ventilators, right? So there was some discussion about, who we should prioritize, who should get the ventilator. So let's say you have two patients who are clinically comparable, but one of them is younger, right? And some people thought that you should prioritize the younger one because they have more future lives to live, and so it's a utilitarian argument, But there may be a fairness consideration as well, which is the younger person has had fewer lives to live, and so it would be unfair to them if they died. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of like it as a rhetorical point. You can make this kind of fair innings argument that the younger person hasn't had a fair shot at life, the older person already has, and so there's just this sort of extra reason to push in the direction that we already had utilitarian reason to prefer anyway, namely to prioritize the younger person. I mean, I'm happy for people to make those arguments. I don't know. I mean, insofar as I have these more sort of utilitarian sympathies, I'm a bit dubious of them, of the fairness idea. I mean, you can imagine a case where the fair innings comes apart from the utilitarian benefit by imagining that, say, that there's a much younger person who you could save with a ventilator now, but also they have terminal cancer and they're going to die a year from now anyway. And so you give them a little bit more of the innings, and that would be fairer than them dying earlier. But if there's someone who's like middle-aged and could live for decades more, I think there's much stronger reason to do that. So there's just going to be tricky questions about how to balance those different values, I guess.
Okay. So in regards to effective altruism as an approach or a principle, for you to change your mind on it, it would have to criticize, convincingly, criticize, I guess, the very basic tenets of it, right? So I guess one way for it to fail is if it's just impossible for us to be more effective in our altruism, right? But that seems false, plainly false, okay? It would fail if we were not supposed to be altruistic, right? Which again seems plainly false, right? It would fail if there could be a convincing argument that showed that ineffective altruism was superior, which seems clearly false.
Puzzling, yeah.
Yeah, right? So it seems quite convincing to me.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear. I mean, if I try to play devil's advocate for a moment, I think maybe the thing that I could imagine being most challenging to effective altruism, sort of as a practical principle, would be if there was compelling sort of psychological evidence that suggested that when people try to think about effectiveness and like try to put it into practice, this ends up being deeply counterproductive, and they're just really bad at it. And that it was like we were so bad at it that we couldn't even overcome whatever problems, whatever biases there were by like trying to. It's just like the very attempt to like try to think in a more sort of economic cost-benefit kind of way would inevitably lead us astray. My sense is that some of the critics might think this, but they don't really make the argument quite explicitly enough, and I don't really know that they have any good evidence to support it. But my sense is that that might be what they believe is why they think effective altruism is bad.
So the concern is that if we try to be effective, we end up not being effective?
Yeah, that's the worry. And I think it might be precisely because of assumptions like, oh, if you're worried about effectiveness, then you might be going to focus too exclusively on things like really strong evidence from randomly controlled trials, and you're not going to look at things like engaging in politics that's much more speculative. I think that's the kind of argument they have in mind. I just don't think that's true. I think it's fine to be like, you can be effectiveness focused and also very open to taking sort of somewhat speculative, high uncertainty, but high upshot kind of moonshot sort of gambles to try to bring about more good in the world. I think it makes a lot of sense to do that. Yeah, I think that might be an argument that some have at least.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another way that effective altruism would be false is if everybody didn't count for one. Right.
Yeah. You could probably have a variation on effective altruism, but maybe it wouldn't really count strictly speak as effective altruism anymore. It'd be
American
effective something
altruism.
Else.
Yeah, that would be weird. But that seems less plausible to me. So let's say, as a final thought experiment, that there are rational aliens, right? And somehow we could affect their well-being. Right? It could come to a point where we prioritize their well-being over ours, correct?
It could, yeah.
If there are enough of them.
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So again, right, it's a very, very bare bones. That I think that would be a very practical limitation there, right? Like, so in a sense, so maybe that might be the biggest criticism. It's the practicality, right? It's supposed to be a practical principle, right? But maybe it's not practical.
Yeah, at least when taken to extremes. So I think, there's this question of how far do you take the idea of effective altruism? And I think one nice thing that's come out of our discussion is this idea that, well, taking it on board at least to some extent seems like a no-brainer. Seems like there are clear moral upshots from being more concerned about effectiveness and impartiality than most people usually otherwise are. But there might be these limit cases where you think it goes too far, where you think it takes into account interests that you think shouldn't be swamping our own interests, cases like that. Or even if you might not go so far as to say that that's definitively wrong, but you could definitely say it's just not psychologically feasible for most human beings to be okay with that. And so you could make those kind of practicality objections.
Yeah, and I think that's where the speciesism comes in. I think most people are just speciesists. I don't think you can get people to care about shrimp anywhere nearly as they care about other human beings.
No, it's very, very hard sell.
Yeah. Okay. I think it's a good place to wrap things up. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you.